Okay, so in this series of tutorials we will use Tinkercad to make a toy consisting of several layered eggs with a puzzle in the center. And the outermost egg will be a shell that can be opened along a sort of zigzaggy cut. So we're going to start by bringing in an egg shape. We'll find it here under characters. So let's bring the egg in here and switch to top view, and we're also going to use orthographic view. The first thing we're going to do with this egg is we will resize it. Now if I resize the egg and I hold the shift key at the same time, then it's going to keep the aspect ratio of the egg, so it's going to stay round. We're going to resize this to 80 by 80 millimeters. Now let's also adjust the height of the egg. Right now we have 106.9. Let's make that around 100 millimeters for the height of the egg. So this egg is solid. If I were to cut it open, you would see that it's solid inside. I will change the material temporarily to transparent so that we can see inside the egg. Now I'll bring a second egg to make a hole in the center. So in the end we will subtract the hole from the egg and I will just be left with the shell. So let's make the width of the shell 4 millimeters on each side. The width of the outer egg is 80 millimeters and we have to subtract 4 and then another 4 because it's 4 millimeters on one side and 4 on the other. So we will end up with 72 millimeters for the width and the depth of the hole inside the egg. Let's also center these. I'm going to center it here on this point, which is at the intersection of these axes. And for the height, let's switch to front view. We're going to make the height also 8 millimeters less. So 8 millimeters less than 100 millimeters will be 92 millimeters. And then I'll bring it up 4 millimeters. So it will be exactly centered in every dimension inside the other egg. So now I have a 4 millimeter shell all around the egg here. So now we select the outer egg, change it back from whole to solid, and then I'll select both. By selecting a rectangle, I can select more than one shape. So I've selected the egg and the hole, two shapes it shows here, and now I'm going to group them, and now we actually have the shell of an egg. We can't see inside this egg now, but I will temporarily switch it to hollow so that we can see that it's actually just a hollow shell. So the next thing we will do here is we'll have to cut out a zigzaggy shape so that there'll be a top and a bottom half of this egg. In order to cut out the shape, we will make a stencil. I will demonstrate how we can use a stencil to cut out the shape any way that we want and also to make the top and the bottom fit together. So we'll start with a cube. And I think I'll also align this cube with the coordinate axes here. So I'll make sure that it's exactly at one of these intersections of the big axes. Now I will make this cube a little bit bigger than the egg itself. Again, when I resize the cube from one corner, I can press the shift key, and this ensures that the cube will retain its shape so that all the sides will be scaling in the same way. And I will just scale this cube to 100 by 100 by 100. So this is the cube. Now in front view, I'm going to bring it down. My egg is 100 millimeters high, so I'll bring this down 60 millimeters. That will more or less put the cut roughly in this area. Okay, so now we'll bring in a little triangle shape here, and I'll temporarily switch my cube to transparent so we can actually see what's behind it. Now this little triangle, the first thing I'm going to do to it is I'll bring it to the top. Now when you have a shape inside another shape, it can be a bit difficult to select because when I click on the triangle, I always end up selecting the cube. So one way around that is to select them both. So I can click and drag to select them both, the triangle and the cube. And then I can shift select the cube, which will actually unselect the cube. So that's a way of selecting the inner shape here. And I'll just bring the triangle up to where it's exactly stuck to the top of this cube here. So that's a height of 40 millimeters right now from my work plane to where the top of the cube is. So let's zoom in to make sure it's exact. I don't want any gap between the triangle and the cube. And now we're going to take this little triangle and we will make it much bigger. So again, I'm going to hold shift, and from 20 by 20, we're going to rescale it to 60 by 60. And because I held the shift key while I was rescaling it, the triangle actually kept its original shape. So it also got higher in addition to getting wider. So now the next thing I have to do is center the triangle with respect to the cube. So fortunately my cube is lined up on these large grid lines here, and it's exactly 100 millimeters wide. So I'm going to center the triangle so that the center of the triangle piece lines up with this line here in the center of the cube. I always want the width to be in even numbers so that the center will also be on one of these grid lines here. Okay, and I'll bring the cube up a little bit. And here's another trick. When you click and you drag an element around, when you press Shift, it's going to restrict it to either a vertical drag or a horizontal. So if you press the Shift key while you drag an element around, it's a good way to adjust only one coordinate, and it can't go sideways when you don't want it to. So now this triangle is in the position that I want it. So this is what I have right now, a triangle attached to the top of a cube. Now I'll select this triangle and I'll duplicate it, and then I'll press Shift again, and I'll move the duplicate straight down by 40 millimeters. So I have two triangles attached to my cube now. Okay, so it looks like the roof on a house. Now I'll select both triangles, this one and this one. I duplicate again, and I rotate the duplicated triangles by 90 degrees. Then I'll select all four of these triangle pieces, and I duplicate, and then I'll rotate by 45 degrees. So that's a very quick way of getting 8 triangles arranged on top of the cube here in a star-shaped pattern, and it's all very symmetric because I was careful to center all the triangles before I rotated them. We will use this later to cut a zigzag pattern into the eggshell, and I don't want that to be completely regular. I want it to be so when I turn the top piece of the egg, there should be only one position where it will fit. So for that reason, I will take each of these triangle pieces and move it up or down. Well, actually not up. I'm going to move them down by random amounts. I'll not pay too much attention to how far I have to move them. I'll just move them by a random amount. I'll take the diagonal ones and make them a little bit further down than the rest of them. Let's see how this looks. So they're not terribly different, but some of them are just slightly more up or down than the others. And I'm going to switch to top view because the egg layer will go here. So I have to make sure there are no flat parts in between these triangle pieces. For example, if I brought this triangle piece down too much, then you would see in the top view that there's actually a part of the top of the cube that is exposed here. So that would not work later when I want to intersect my egg with the stencil. So let me bring this up so that I don't have that. So now it looks green, green, green everywhere where the egg is going to go. So this assembly here, consisting of the cube, which I will make solid again, and these triangles attached to the top, that is going to be part of my stencil. Now before I do anything with that, let me just make a copy of the cube because I will need this copy later. And for now, I'll just move it out of the way. I'm just going to use 100 millimeters here for the distance. And that will make it easier when I need to bring it back down later to bring it into a precise location. Now I'll select all of these bottom pieces. That's the bottom part of my stencil, and I group them. Okay, so now I have a single piece which has a sort of triangle-shaped roof. It doesn't really matter if some of the triangle parts are sticking out on the sides of this cube here. That is just fine. The next thing I will do is I'll bring the other part of the cube that we stashed away here back down. And I'll bring it back down to exactly where the top of this cube was. So that should actually be 40 millimeters above the work plane. So now the bottom of this red cube fits exactly the top of this red cube. They're both exactly 40 millimeters from the work plane. So now I'll select the bottom piece. This is the actual stencil for the bottom part of the egg. I will duplicate this, and then I'll take the duplicated piece and turn it into a hole. Then I'll shift click the top cube, which is still cube shaped. So now I've selected the top cube and the hole for the bottom. If I merge these two pieces, now I have a top piece which is exactly the complement of the bottom piece here. So if I temporarily move this up and we go into the three-dimensional view, we can see that the bottom of the top stencil now has some material cut away from it. So it's exactly the opposite of the bottom stencil. So I'll go ahead and press Command Z to move the pieces back together so that they fit snugly. So now I will take both of these stencils and I'll turn them both into holes. So we're going to use these to cut the top and bottom pieces from this egg here. So let me switch back to top view. I'll select both of these stencil pieces, and first of all I'm going to duplicate them because I usually like to keep my stencils for later reference. I'll just move them out of the way somewhere, and I like to keep track of their location, so I'll move them exactly 100 millimeters over and 100 millimeters down from where they were. And now I'll select both of these pieces and I'll move them over the egg. So they should go exactly 100 millimeters to the left, not 98.43 or anything like that. This way I ensure that my egg and my stencil are exactly centered with respect to each other. So the reason I got numbers like 98.43 here was because of these corners. By default, what Tinkercad would like to do is align these corner points on the millimeter grid. So instead, I typed in the -100 to make sure that the whole stencil would end up in exactly this spot where it now is. So now I'll use these two stencils, the top one and the bottom one, to cut the egg into two halves. The first thing I have to do is select the egg. Now, because the egg is behind the stencils, I can't select it from the outside. So a good way to do it again is to select all three pieces, the egg and the two stencils, and then just shift click on the stencils to unselect them. So now I only have one shape selected and it's actually the egg in the middle. Now I will duplicate the egg because one part will become the top and one part will become the bottom. So now one of these duplicates is selected and I will shift click the top stencil to also select it. And now simply, because the stencil is a whole, if I group now, this is going to remove the top part of the egg and it will keep the bottom part. So it takes a moment to compute this here. Now the top part of one of the egg copies has been removed. Now I'll select the other egg copy and the bottom stencil. And again I'll group. This will remove the bottom stencil from the egg. So I'll only be left with the top part of this copy of the egg. This again takes a moment to compute because it's quite a complicated shape. But when it's finished, you'll see that the egg now has a zigzaggy cut in it. And that finishes the first part of the project. Come back for the next part to see how we're going to make an eggshell with a hinge in it.